Section 3 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Julius Caesar, Part 1. 100 to 44 B.C. Imperialism. The most august name in the history of the old Roman world, and perhaps of all antiquity, is that of Julius Caesar, and a new interest has of late been created in this extraordinary man by the brilliant sketch of his life and character by Mr. Froude, who has whitewashed him, as is the fashion with hero worshippers, like Carlyle in his history of Frederick II. But it is not an easy thing to reverse the verdict of the civilized world for 2000 years, although a man of genius can say many interesting things and offer valuable suggestions. In his Life of Caesar, Mr. Froude seems to vindicate imperialism, not merely as a great necessity in the corrupt times which succeeded the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, but as a good thing in itself. It seems to me that while there was a general tendency to imperialism in the Roman world for 100 or 200 years before Christ, the whole tendency of modern governments is against it, and has been since the Second English Revolution. It still exists in Russia and Turkey, possibly in Germany and Austria, yet constitutional forms of government seem to be gradually taking its place. What a change in England, France, Italy, and Spain during the last 100 years! What a breaking up of the old absolutism of the Bourbons! Even the imperialism of Napoleon is held in detestation by a large class of the French nation. It may have been necessary for such a man as Caesar to arise when the Romans had already conquered a great part of the civilized world, and when the various provinces which composed the empire needed a firm, stable, and uniform government in the hands of a single man, in order to promote peace and law, the first conditions of human society. But it is one thing to recognize the majesty of divine Providence in furnishing a remedy for the peculiar evils of an age or people, and quite another thing to make this remedy a panacea for all the future conditions of nations. If we believe in the moral government of this world by a divine and supreme intelligence whom we call God, then it is not difficult to see in Julius Caesar, after nearly 2000 years, an instrument of Providence like Constantine, Charlemagne, Richelieu, and Napoleon himself. It matters nothing whether Caesar was good or bad, whether he was a patriot or a usurper, so far as his ultimate influence is concerned, if he was the instrument of an overruling power; for God chooses such instruments as he pleases. Even in human governments it is sometimes expedient to employ rogues in order to catch rogues, or to head off some peculiar evil that honest people do not know how to manage. But because a bad man is selected by a higher power to do some peculiar work, it does not follow that this bad man should be praised for doing it, especially if the work is good only so far as it is overruled. Both human consciousness and Christianity declare that it is a crime to shed needless and innocent blood. If ambition prompts a man to destroy his rivals and fill the world with miseries in order to climb to supreme power, then it is an insult to the human understanding to make this ambition synonymous with patriotism. A successful conqueror may be far-sighted and enlightened, whatever his motives for conquest; but because he is enlightened, it does not follow that he fights battles with the supreme view of benefiting his country, like William III. And George Washington. He may have taken the sword chiefly to elevate himself, or, after having taken the sword with a view of rendering important services, and, having rendered these services, he may have been diverted from his original intentions, and have fought for the gratification of personal ambition, losing sight utterly of the cause in which he embarked. Now this is the popular view which the world has taken of Caesar. Shakespeare may have been unjust in his verdict, but it is a verdict which has been sustained by most writers and by popular sentiment during the last 300 years. It was also the verdict of Cicero, of the Roman Senate, and of ancient historians. It is one of my objects to show in this lecture how far this verdict is just. It is another object to point out the services of Caesar to the State, which, however great and honestly to be praised, do not offset crime. Caius Julius Caesar belonged to one of the proudest and most ancient of the patrician families of Rome, a branch of the gens Julia, which claimed a descendant from Iules, the son of Aeneas. His father, Caius Julius, married Aurelia, a noble matron of the Cotta family, and his aunt Julia married the great Marius; so that, though he was a patrician of the purest blood, his family alliances were either plebeian or on the liberal side in politics. He was born 100 years before Christ, and received a good education, but was not precocious like Cicero. There was nothing remarkable about his childhood. He was a tall and handsome man with dark, piercing eyes, sallow complexion, large nose, full lips, refined and intellectual features, and thick neck. He was particular about his appearance, and showed a studied negligence of dress. His uncle Marius, in the height of his power, marked him out for promotion, and made him a priest of Jupiter when he was 14 years old. On the death of his father, a man of praetorian rank, and therefore a senator, at the age of 17 Caesar married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, which connected him still more closely with the popular party. He was only a few years younger than Cicero and Pompey. When he was 18 he attracted the notice of Sulla, then dictator, who wished him to divorce his wife and take such a one as he should propose, which the young man, at the risk of his life, refused to do. This boldness and independence of course displeased the dictator, who predicted his future. "In this young Caesar," said he, "there are many Mariuses." But he did not kill him, owing to the intercession of powerful friends. The career of Caesar may be divided into three parts, during each of which he appeared in a different light. The first, until he began the conquest of Gaul, at the age of 43; the second, the time of his military exploits in Gaul, by which he rendered great services and gained popularity and fame; and the third, that of his civil wars, dictatorship, and imperial reign. In the first period of his life, for about 25 years, he made a mark indeed, but rendered no memorable services to the State, and won no especial fame. Had he died at the age of 43, his name would probably not have descended to our times, except as a leading citizen, a good lawyer, and a powerful debater. He saw military service almost as a matter of course, but he was not particularly distinguished as a general, nor did he select the military profession. He was eloquent, aspiring, and able, as a young patrician; but, like Cicero, it would seem that he sought the civil service, and made choice of the law, by which to rise in wealth and power. He was a politician from the first, and his ambition was to get a seat in the Senate, like all other able and ambitious men. Senators were not hereditary, however nobly born, but gained their seats by election to certain high offices in the gift of the people, called curule offices, which entitled them to senatorial position and dignity. A seat in the Senate was the great object of Roman ambition, because the Senate was the leading power of the State, and controlled the army, the treasury, religious worship, and the provinces. The governors and ambassadors, as well as the dictators, were selected by this body of aristocrats. In fact, to the Senate was entrusted the supreme administration of the empire, although the source of power was technically and theoretically in the people, or those who had the right of suffrage; and as the people elected those magistrates whose offices entitled them to a seat in the Senate was virtually elected by the people. Senators held their places for life, but could be weeded out by the censors. And as the Senate in its best days contained between 300 and 400 men, not all the curule magistrates could enter it, unless there were vacancies; but a selection from them was made by the censors. So the Senate, in all periods of the Roman Republic, was composed of experienced men, of those who had previously held the great offices of the State. To gain a seat in the Senate, therefore, it was necessary to be elected by the people to one of the great magistracies. In the early days of the Republic, the people were incorruptible; but when foreign conquest, slavery, and other influences demoralized them, they became venal, and sold their votes. Hence only rich men, ordinarily, were elected to high office, and the rich men, as a rule, belonged to the old families. So the Senate was made up not only of experienced men, but of the aristocracy. There were rich men outside the Senate, successful plebeians, men who had made fortunes by trade, bankers, monopolists, and others; but these, if ambitious of social position or political influence, became gradually absorbed among the senatorial families. Those who could afford to buy the votes of the people, and those only, became magistrates and senators. Hence the demagogues were rich men, and belonged to the highest ranks, like Clodius and Catiline. It thus happened that, when Julius Caesar came upon the stage, the aristocracy controlled the elections. The people were indeed sovereign, but they abdicated their power to those who would pay the most for it. The constitution was popular in name; in reality it was aristocratic, since only rich men, generally noble, could be elected to office. Rome was ruled by aristocrats, who became rich as the people became poor. The great source of senatorial wealth was in the control of the provinces. The governors were chosen by the Senate and from the Senate, and it required only 1 or 2 years to make a fortune as a governor, like Verres. The ultimate cause which threw power into the hands of the rich and noble was the venality of the people. The aristocratic demagogues bought them, in the same way that rich monopolists in our day control legislatures. The people are too numerous in this country to be directly bought up, even if it were possible, and the prizes they confer are not high enough to tempt rich men, as they did in Rome. A man, therefore, who would rise to power at Rome must necessarily bribe the people, must purchase their votes, unless he was a man of extraordinary popularity, some great orator like Cicero, or successful general like Marius or Sulla; and it was difficult to get popularity except as a lawyer and orator, or as a general. Caesar, like Cicero and Hortensius, chose the law as a means of rising in the world, for though of ancient family, he was not rich. He must make money by his profession, or he must borrow it if he would secure office. It seems he borrowed it. How he contrived to borrow such vast sums as he spent on elections I do not know. He probably made friends of rich men like Crassus, who became security for him. He was in debt to the amount of 1,500,000 of our money before he held office. He was a bold political gambler, and played for high stakes. It would seem that he had very winning and courteous manners, though he was not distinguished for popular oratory. His terse and pregnant sentences, however, won the admiration of his friend Cicero, a brother lawyer, and he was very social and hospitable. He was on the liberal side in politics, and attacked the abuses of the day, which won him popular favor. At first he lived in a modest house with his wife and mother in the Subarra, without attracting much notice. The first office to which he was elected was that of a military tribune, soon after his sojourn of 2 years in Rhodes to learn from Apollonius the arts of oratory. His next office was that of a quaestor, which enabled him to enter the Senate at the age of 32, and his third office that of aedile, which gave him the control of the public buildings. The aediles were expected to decorate the city, and this gave him opportunities of cultivating popularity by splendor and display. The first thing which brought him into notice as an orator was a funeral oration he pronounced on his aunt Julia, the widow of Marius. The next fortunate event of his life was his marriage with Pompeia, a cousin of Pompey, who was then the foremost man in Rome, having distinguished himself in Spain and in putting down the slave insurrection under Spartacus. But Pompey's great career in the East had not yet commenced, so that the future rivals at the time were friends. Caesar glorified Pompey in the Senate, which by virtue of his office he had lately entered. The next step to greatness was his election by the people, through the use of immense amounts of borrowed money, to the great office of Pontifex Maximus, which made him the pagan Pope of Rome for life, with a grand palace to live in. Soon after he was made praetor, which office entitled him to a provincial government, and he was sent by the Senate to Spain as propraetor, completed the conquest of the peninsula, and sent to Borne vast sums of money. These services entitled him to a triumph, but, as he presented himself at the same time as a candidate for the consulship, he was obliged to forego the triumph, and was elected consul without opposition. His vanity ever yielded to his ambition. Thus far there was nothing remarkable in Caesar's career. He had risen by power of money, like other aristocrats, to the highest offices of the state, showing abilities indeed, but not that extraordinary genius which has made him immortal. He was the leader of the political party which Sulla had put down, yet he was not a revolutionist like the Gracchi. He was an aristocratic reformer, like Lord John Russell before the passage of the Reform Bill, whom the people adored. He was a liberal, but not a radical. Of course he was not a favorite with the senators, who wished to perpetuate abuses. He was intensely disliked by Cato, a most excellent and honest man, but narrow-minded and conservative, a sort of Duke of Wellington without his military abilities. The Senate would make no concessions, would part with no privileges, and submit to no changes. Like Lord Eldon, it adhered to what was established because it was established. Caesar, as consul, began his administration with conciliation, and he had the support of Crassus with his money, and of Pompey as the representative of the army, who was then flushed with his Eastern conquests, pompous, vain, and proud, but honest and incorruptible. Cicero stood aloof, the greatest man in the Senate, whose aristocratic privileges he defended. He might have aided Caesar in the speaking department, but as a new man he was jealous of his prerogatives, and always conservative, like Burke, whom he resembled in his eloquence and turn of mind and fondness for literature and philosophy. Failing to conciliate the aristocrats, Caesar became a sort of Mirabeau, and appealed to the people, causing them to pass his celebrated Leges Juliae, or reform bills, the chief of which was the Land Act, which conferred portions of the public lands on Pompey's disbanded soldiers for settlement, a wise thing, which senators opposed, since it took away their monopoly. Another act required the provincial governors, on their return from office, to render an account of their stewardship and hand in their accounts for public inspection. The Julian laws were also designed to prevent the plunder of the public revenues, the debasing of the coin, the bribery of judges and of the people at elections. There were laws also for the protection of citizens from violence, and sundry other reforms which were enlightened and useful. In the passage of these laws against the will of the Senate, we see that the people were still recognized as sovereign in legislation. The laws were good. All depended on their execution, and the Senate, as the administrative body, could practically defeat their operation when Caesar's term of office expired; and this it unwisely determined to do. The last thing it wished was any reform whatever, and, as Mr. Froude thinks, there must have been either reform or revolution. But this is not so clear to me. Aristocracy was all powerful when money could buy the people, and when the people had no virtue, no ambition, no intelligence. The struggle at Rome in the latter days of the Republic was not between the people and the aristocracy, but between the aristocracy and the military chieftains on one side, and those demagogues whom it feared on the other. The result showed that the aristocracy feared and distrusted Caesar, and he used the people only to advance his own ends, of course, in the name of reform and patriotism. And when he became dictator, he kicked away the ladder on which he climbed to power. It was imperialism that he established, neither popular rights nor aristocratic privileges. He had no more love of the people than he had of those proud aristocrats who afterwards murdered him. But the empire of the world, to which Caesar at that time may or may not have aspired, who can tell, but probably not, was not to be gained by civil services, or reforms, or arguments in law courts, or by holding great offices, or haranguing the people at the rostrum, or making speeches in the Senate, where he was hated for his liberal views and enlightened mind, rather than from any fear of his overturning the constitution, but by military services and heroic deeds, and the devotion of a tried and disciplined regular army. Caesar was now 43 years of age, being in the full maturity of his powers. At the close of his term as consul he sought a province where the military talents were indispensable, and where he could have a long term of office. The Senate gave him the woods and forests, an unsubdued country where he would have hard work and unknown perils, and from which it was probable he would never return. They sent him to Gaul. But this was just the field for his marvellous military genius, then only partially developed, and the second period of his career now began. It was during this second period that he rendered his most important services to the state and earned his greatest fame. The dangers which threatened the empire came from the west, and not the east. Asia was already subdued by Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey, or was on the point of being subdued. Mithridates was a formidable enemy, but he aimed at establishing an Asiatic empire, not conquering the European provinces. He was not so dangerous as even Pyrrhus had been. Moreover, the conquest of the East was comparatively easy, over worn-out races and an effete civilization. It gave éclat to Sulla and Pompey, as the conquest of India with a handful of British troops made Clive and Hastings famous. It required no remarkable military genius, nor was it necessary for the safety of Italy. Conquest over the Oriental monarchies meant only spoliation. It was prompted by greed and vanity more than by a sense of danger. Pompey brought back money enough from the East to enrich all his generals, and the Senate besides, or rather the state, which a few aristocrats practically owned. But the conquest of Gaul would be another affair. It was peopled with hardy races, who cast greedy eyes on the empire of the Romans, or on some of its provinces, and who were being pushed forward to invasion by a still braver people beyond the Rhine, races kindred to those Teutons whom Marius had defeated. There was no immediate danger from the Germans, but there was ultimate danger, as proved by the union they made in the time of Marcus Antonius for the invasion of the Roman provinces. It was necessary to raise a barrier against their inundations. It was also necessary to subdue the various Celtic tribes of Gaul, who were getting restless and uneasy. There was no money in a conquest over barbarians, except so far as they could be sold into slavery, but there was danger in it. The whole country was threatened with insurrections, leagues, and invasion, from the Alps to the ocean. There was a confederacy of hostile kings and chieftains; they commanded innumerable forces; they controlled important posts and passes. The Gauls had long made fixed settlements, and had built bridges and fortresses. They were not so warlike as the Germans, but they were yet formidable enemies. United, they were like a volcano giving signs of approaching eruption, and at any moment, and hardly without warning, another lava stream might be poured down Venetia and Lombardy. To rescue the empire from such dangers was the work of Caesar, and it was no small undertaking. The Senate had given him unlimited power, for 5 years over Gaul, and then a terra incognita, an indefinite country, comprising the modern states of France, Holland, Switzerland, Belgium, and a part of Germany. Afterward the Senate extended the governorship 5 years more, so difficult was the work of conquest, and so formidable were the enemies. But it was danger which Caesar loved. The greater the obstacles, the better he was pleased, and the greater was the scope for his genius, which at first was not appreciated, for the best part of his life had been passed in Rome as a lawyer and orator and statesman. But he had a fine constitution, robust health, temperate habits, and unbounded energies. He was free to do as he liked with several legions, and had time to perfect his operations. And his legions were trained to every kind of labor and hardship. They could build bridges, cut down forests, and drain swamps, as well as march with a weight of 80 pounds to the man. They could make their own shoes, mend their own clothes, repair their own arms, and construct their own tents. They were as familiar with the axe and spade as they were with the lance and sword. They were inured to every kind of danger and difficulty, and not one of them was personally braver than the general who led them, or more skillful in riding a horse, or fording a river, or climbing a mountain. None of them could be more abstemious. Luxury is not one of the peculiarities of successful generals in barbaric countries. To give a minute sketch of the various encounters with the different tribes and nations that inhabited the vast country he was sent to conquer and govern would be impossible in a lecture like this. One must read Caesar's own account of these conflicts with Helvetii, Aedui, Remi, Nervi, Belgae, Veneti, Arverni, Aquitani, Ubi, Eubiones, Treveri, and other nations between the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Rhine, and the sea. Their numbers were immense, and they were well armed, and had cavalry, military stores, efficient leaders, and indomitable courage. When beaten in one place, they sprang up in another, like the Saxons with whom Charlemagne contended. They made treaties only to break them. They fought with the desperation of heroes who had their wives and children, firesides and altars to guard, yet against them Caesar was uniformly successful. He was at times in great peril, yet he never lost but one battle, and this through the fault of his generals. Yet he had able generals whom he selected himself, Labienus, who afterwards deserted him, Antony, Publius Crassus, Cotta, Sabinus, all belonging to the aristocracy. They made mistakes, but Caesar never. They would often have been cut off but for Caesar's timely aid. When we consider the dangers to which he was constantly exposed, the amazing difficulties he had to surmount, the hardships he had to encounter, the fears he had to allay, the murmurs he was obliged to silence, the rivers he was compelled to cross in the face of enemies, the forests it was necessary to penetrate, the swamps and mountains and fortresses which impeded his marches, we are amazed at his skill and intrepidity, to say nothing of his battles with forces 10 times more numerous than his own. His fertility of resources, his lightning rapidity of movement, his sagacity and insight, his perfection of discipline, his careful husbandry of forces, his ceaseless diligence, his intrepid courage, the confidence with which he inspired his soldiers, his brilliant successes, victory after victory, with enormous number of captives by which he and the state became enriched, all these things dazzled his countrymen and gave him a fame such as no general had ever earned before. He conquered a population of warriors to be numbered by millions, with no aid from charts and maps, exposed perpetually to treachery and false information. He had to please and content an army of 1,000 miles from home, without supplies, except such as were precarious, living on the plainest food, and doomed to infinite labors and drudgeries, besides attacking camps and assaulting fortresses, and fighting pitched battles. Yet he won their love, their respect, and their admiration, and by an urbanity, a kindness, and a careful protection of their interests, such as no general ever showed before. He was a hero performing perpetual wonders, as chivalrous as the knights of the Middle Ages. No wonder he was adored, like a Moses in the wilderness, like a Napoleon in his early conquests. This conquest of Gaul, during which he drove the Germans back to their forests, and inaugurated a policy of conciliation and moderation which made the Gauls the faithful allies of Rome, and their country is the most fertile and important province, furnishing able men both for the Senate and the army, was not only a great feat of genius, but a great service, a transcendent service to the state, which entitled Caesar to a magnificent reward. Had it been cordially rendered to him, he might have been contented with a sort of perpetual consulship, and with the éclat of being the foremost man of the empire. The people would have given him anything in their power to give, for he was as much an idol to them as Napoleon became to the Parisians after the conquest of Italy. He had rendered services as brilliant as those of Scipio, of Marius, of Sulla, or of Pompey. If he did not save Italy from being subsequently overrun by barbarians, he postponed their irruptions for 200 years. And he had partially civilized the country he had subdued, and introduced Roman institutions. He had also created an army of disciplined veterans, such as never before was seen. He perfected military mechanism, that which kept the Empire together after all vitality had fled. He was the greatest master of the art of war known to antiquity. Such transcendent military excellence and such great services entitled him to the gratitude and admiration of the whole Empire, although he enriched himself and his soldiers with the spoils of his 10 Years' War, and did not, so far as I can see, bring great sums into the national treasury. Section 4